I'm Taryn Southern. I'm an AI artist and creative technologist, and I've been Chief Storytelling Officer at BlackRock Neurotech for the past 3.5 years. We make implantable brain-computer interfaces. And I'm really excited about today's conversation, which is with some of my favorite people. We're going to dive into all things AI, robotics, and ethics.
Hello, my new friends. The first question that you sent was, what constitutes the boundary between natural life and artificial life? And 20 years ago, I claimed that even cars are alive. Why? Artificial life researchers back then have had offered definitions of life such as it must reproduce and it must evolve and so on. And so cars clearly are alive too, according to most of these definitions. For example, they evolve and they multiply. Yes, it is true, they need complex environments with car factories to do that, but living animals also need complex environments full of chemicals and other animals to reproduce. And the DNA information by itself does not suffice. There is no obvious fundamental difference between an organism whose self-replication information is stored in its DNA and a car whose self-replication information is stored in a car builder's manual in the glove compartment. So to copy itself, the organisms need their mother's womb, plus numerous other objects and living beings and the environment, such as trillions of bacteria inside and outside of the mother's body. And the car needs iron mines and supply chains and factories and human workers and so on. Now, what's missing? What is the thing that we don't have yet? In a recent TED Talk on AI, which is easy to find on the web, I pointed out once more something that I have said for decades. We already have self-improving machine learning software, but we don't have yet self-improving hardware. And that will be the next big step. It will transform not just human civilization, but the entire universe. So I'm talking about self-replicating, self-improving societies of physical robots and other machines. And the question is, how far are we from that point? Maybe pretty close. I have always pointed out, once we have smart, but not super smart, general purpose robots that can learn to operate all the machines and tools that are currently operated by humans, once we have that, and we are maybe not so far away from that, then they will also be able to operate and repair the machines required to make more of those robots. Let that sink in. So this includes the machines that mine the raw material from the ground, refine it, screw parts together, repair broken 3D printers and robots and robot factories and so on, doing all the physical jobs that currently only machine operating humans can do. So basically a machine civilization that can self-replicate without humans, and then of course improve itself. Self-improving hardware as opposed to the already existing self-improving software. And that will change everything. Now, the second question you sent was, in light of Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, what the regulatory frameworks are necessary. And the problem with Asimov's 3 laws is that they are logically inconsistent. Even if we look at the first law only, it does not make any sense. So the first law, what does it say? A robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. Now, to implement that law, the robot must be able to perfectly predict the consequences of its actions or inactions until the end of time, to make sure that its actions or inactions don't harm any human, including yet unborn humans. And of course, in this universe, this is total nonsense. Now, the logical inconsistency of Asimov's laws is precisely the reason why he could write all those fun stories about robots that experience conflicts between the laws. And it makes for nice literature, but it's totally useless for practical applications. Now, the next question you sent was, as AI systems approach potential sentience, should they be granted a form of representation or voice in societal and political decision-making processes. And my favorite short story on that topic is The Washing Machine Tragedy by Stanislav Lem, Washing Machine Tragedy. And it was written half a century ago. Because in the previous century, many people have thought about that and have expressed their thoughts in all kinds of stories. Now, in Stanislav Lem's old story, two competing makers of washing machines construct more and more sophisticated washing machines. And and soon these washing machines can solve many other problems besides washing clothes. And they become really smart. And some of them look more like sex bombs. And the story ends with a big public debate on ethical questions, such as whether clever machines should get human rights. That was 50 years ago, you know. And during the debate, it is accidentally discovered that all of the debaters, all of them, are actually washing machines disguised as humans. So what can we learn from that? We can learn from that probably it won't be humans who decide which rights intelligent machines will have.
Jürgen, I'd love to pause.
And then the fourth question you sent was, how can we balance innovation with caution in the creation of advanced AI and androids? And my immediate reaction is there is no way of balancing this because there is no us, the humans. Often you hear arguments about us, the humans, but there is no us, the humans. You ask 10 different humans and you will have 10 different opinions about what is good. And some of those opinions will be completely incompatible with each other. Just look at Ukraine's humans and their AI-based drones, which are, as we speak, fighting against Russia's humans and their AI-based drones. How might the merging of AI and human consciousness, that's the next question, the merging of AI and human consciousness through neural interfaces or cognitive augmentation reshape our understanding of identity, existence, and human rights? So that is the last question that you sent, which I'm trying to answer quickly. First of all, as I have frequently pointed out in the past decades, of course, there won't be a single AI, and there won't be a single AI dominating everything. No, there will be trillions of different kinds of AIs, just like there are millions of different kinds of life. And they'll try to optimize all kinds of partially conflicting goals or utility functions. And many of these utility functions and goals will be generated automatically by the AIs themselves. So my lab had already evolved utility functions in the previous millennium. It's an old hat from the previous millennium. And so all kinds of AIs will try to survive and adapt in rapidly changing niches of AI ecologies, driven by intense competition and collaboration that lie beyond our current imagination. And now some humans, and that's addressing your question, some humans may hope to become immortal parts of such AI ecologies through brain scans and mind uploads into virtual realities or into robots. And that's actually a physically plausible idea discussed in science fiction since the 1960s. I think the first story about that was Simulacrum 3 by Daniel F. Galui. 1964, something like that. And it's already becoming a reality, at least for flies, at least for fly brains, as of 2024. So now apparently we can upload fly brains, and in the uploaded virtual paradise or simulation, they react exactly as the real fly brains do in the real world. Now, if that is possible also for humans, and there's no obvious reason why it shouldn't be possible, what does that mean? It means that to compete in rapidly evolving AI ecologies, where there will be not just uploaded minds, no, there will be true native AIs. Most of the uploaded human minds will have to succumb to the temptations of becoming superhuman. Because, they will say, why should I have just 2 eyes instead of a million eyes? Why should I have just 2 actuators instead of millions of them? And And just to compete, eventually they will have to change beyond recognition, becoming something very different, something very non-human in the process. And that's why I always have claimed that traditional humans won't play a significant role in the spreading of intelligence across the cosmos. But that's okay, because you shouldn't think of humans as the crown of creation. Instead, we should view human civilization as part of a much grander scheme and an important step, but not the last one, on the path of the universe from very simple initial conditions towards higher and higher complexity. And now it seems ready for the next step, a step comparable to the invention of life itself 3.5 billion years ago, when chemistry became biology. And now biology is about to become a self-improving, rapidly growing AI sphere that can expand where biology can't.
So I'd love to just start by having each of you quickly introduce yourself. We'll start with you, Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andrew Steele. I'm a longevity scientist, so I'm coming at this as, I think, the only biologist on the panel, thinking about, in my day job, how we can live longer, healthier lives by understanding the aging process. And of course, given the rapid advances in data in biology and artificial intelligence, this topic could be of crucial importance to that.
I'm Gary Marcus. I'm a cognitive scientist and AI researcher. I've actually published in biology a little bit. But I'm not a card-carrying biologist. I have many things to say in response to Jürgen if I get a chance, but I found that to be fascinating and entertaining, like everything that Jürgen does, and I'm glad to be here.
Hello, my name is Georg Dalle. I'm a film producer, and recent work is a film called Eternal You, which is a documentary about people who create digital avatars of their deceased family members and start communicating with them. So we've been doing films about tech topics, AI, social media for 15 years. So that's a bit our point of view, how to bring that to a broad audience. And I'm very happy to share the panel with Marcus, who is as a small appearance in our film, but we never met in person before, so that's a funny coincidence.
I just learned that I was in that film.
Well, I'd love to jump in with a sort of broader question. Obviously, the lines between human and machine are blurring very, very fast. We've got AI that can think, robots that can move just like us, and brain-computer interfaces, which are making it quite possible to upgrade our own brains. So let's start by just hearing your thoughts on what actually makes something alive. Robots can mimic emotions, AI can have conversations, so where's the line between real and artificial life? I know you have a lot of thoughts on this, Gary, so I'm going to start with you.
I think it's actually tricky. I couldn't tell in Jürgen's opening riff whether he was kidding or not. So I'm trying to see his reaction, but it's low resolution here. I don't think that the line is completely obvious. Usually we have associated alive with certain sets of biological processes, and Jürgen is quite right that there are at least parallels there. I have a hard time wrapping my mind around the notion of a car factory and car and so forth being life. To me, that seems like an ontological mistake. I think that we can look at cases like, I have my cell phone, it augments my cognition, may also hurt my cognition in various ways. I don't think it's part of me, but it's certainly well integrated into my life. I've become dependent on it. I don't think that makes the phone alive. That seems to me like a category error. There are a whole set of philosophical questions where there is no fact of the matter. It's just fundamentally, basically, how impressed are you by certain arguments? But you have to start with axioms, and then you go from there. Is that Peter Singer there? Peter Singer has gone even further than Jürgen into pursuing unusual premises all the way to their extreme. And I think that philosophers sometimes do that very well and very interesting. You make the best argument relative to a set of axioms that you accept, and not everybody accepts those axioms. So let's take a thermostat. In my view, a thermostat does not think. But a thermostat, see, that was a piece of audio equipment protesting where I was about to go. The piece of audio equipment knew that what I was about to say was that a thermostat, I don't really think it thinks, even though it can maintain a constant temperature. You take the simplest thermostat, a bimetal strip, and it does what it does. I don't want to accord cognition. Sometimes we make a distinction between, rule following versus rule obeying or something like that. So you say planets follow elliptical trajectories, but the planets don't have something in their core where they're, doing the math in order to calculate where they're supposed to go next. So for me, I would say that's not really thinking, that's not really following rules in the same sense that a person or actually a computer could. But you do have to start with these axioms and go from there. And things can matter. So, Peter's philosophy matters for how we treat other people, how we treat animals. It was the expanding circle, right? So Peter has this wonderful and interesting idea that we attribute larger and larger, I'm embarrassed to do this in front of Peter, but with larger and larger circles, he's embarrassed too, larger and larger circles in which we attribute concerns to. We start with our immediate family and then maybe our neighbors and our friends and neighbors and maybe our nations, etc. And so we could do that with machines. It will have huge consequence if we do that with machines. So if we start to give certain rights to machines, they might annihilate us. We might have a democracy that goes very badly for us if we do that. I personally don't want to go there, but that's ultimately has to do with an axiom that I'm making about traditional biological life as opposed to the machines. Do the machines think? I think that's a different question. I'm not at all impressed with large language models. We could go into why. I think they're wildly overrated. I would not attribute sentience to them. But that doesn't mean that no other future AI might not deserve the label of thinking. I would actually sooner give the label of thinking to a GPS navigation system that I think does have representations of roads and where you're going. It's transparent what those representations are. It goes through some computation. I'm willing actually to call that thinking. I'm not willing to call it emotion or consciousness. So there are all these lines and we have to make decisions about them. But I think some AI might eventually qualify for sentience. We'd want to be really clear about what those definitions are. And personally, I'd rather we didn't go there. I think it is, we already opened a Pandora's box with LLMs, which is changing society in some ways for the better, but many ways for the worse. Opening Pandora's box of sentient AI, which will probably happen even if it shouldn't, does open questions about rights and opens questions about systems that we basically can't predict what they do and they're powerful. I think it's a mistake. We shouldn't go there. But, whether we could in principle, maybe.
Nick, where do you sit in all of this?
Yeah, so I think that the integration of digital minds into the society of beings that are accorded moral status is one of the key challenges that we need to meet. I have talked in some of my earlier work about the need for AI alignment to make sure the AIs don't run amok. And of course, there is the perpetual challenge of ensuring that we humans don't use these increasingly powerful tools to oppress each other or to wage war on each other. But then I think there is this third emerging challenge, which is to make sure that we don't oppress and abuse these digital minds that we are creating. That even if perhaps they are not sentient today, although I think it's harder to be confident about that than some people would want to believe. Eventually, and perhaps quite soon, they plausibly will satisfy the various criteria that philosophers or neuroscientists or cognitive scientists have proposed for what makes one system conscious and another system not. There's the global workspace theory, attention schema theory, higher order representation theory, etc. And for many of those, you can already sort of check the boxes in some current AI systems. And ultimately, I think it's plausible that most people will be digital. And I think this is probably the view that Jürgen also has, that ultimately these machine minds, that they just can be more powerful and more of them and cheaper to implement and more suitable for work in outside our local planetary system, etc. So it might matter a great deal for whether the future actually ought to be viewed as a utopia or a dystopia, how well things go, not just for humans and for other biological animals, but also for these digital minds themselves. And one place where maybe, I don't know if it's a disagreement, but I would take a slightly different direction than Jürgen did in his very nice presentation is maybe having more hope that there could be a future where both biological humans of different kinds and groups could coexist with this ecology of machine minds. I don't think it's a given, but the world is very big. And you could imagine some sort of deal where remote galaxies are all for the AIs to optimize. Maybe Earth itself is set aside as a sort of nature preserve for the most conservative humans who want to just keep doing the old stuff that they have been doing for thousands of years. And then, the solar system and its surroundings are for the transhumans or people who eventually want to upgrade themselves. I don't have a precise blueprint for that, but at least in principle, there is the potential for a deal that could benefit all parties, and maybe not give everybody 100% of what they want, but give everybody sort of, 98% plus of what they want. And I think that's what we should be steering towards.
If I can, I want to push Nick on one piece of that, which is the oppression part. What would it constitute to oppress a machine? So I'm pretty sure if I make a machine do search and replace on a very large document, even though I would never do that to a human, that I'm not actually oppressing, at least Microsoft Word, let's say, if I do that. It just doesn't seem to me to be part of the machinery there for there to be a notion of oppression. It's just following some algorithm. I know we're going to say, well, what about people? And we can come back to there. But what are the criteria for saying that you would be oppressing a system? I think it's a legitimate question to ask.
Question that people need to think about more. I think we don't yet see clearly, and in fact, I'm trying to encourage this field of digital minds ethics to start to study these questions. I would say that one sufficient criteria, but not necessary criterion, would be if you have a sentient digital mind that is actually suffering badly while it is performing this task. I think probably an AI could have moral status even if it is not sentient or conscious. If it has, for example, stable preferences that it can reflectively endorse and the conception of self as existing through time, if it is able to respond to reason, etc., etc. I think it's plausible that in that case too, we can have moral reasons to seek to respect its interests and preferences. And of course, different moral philosophers, if you ask them, will have different ways of trying to ground this talk about moral obligations and moral status and the various misuses and wrongs and abuse that can come from not respecting that. I think, just hand-waving a bit, that we can think of cooperative schemes, that norms kind of function as principles in cooperative schemes, maybe idealized principles. And just as we have various norms that regulate conduct between humans and sometimes between human and human institutions, so too we could have these cooperative norms in a context where there are also AI agents. And in fact, it might be very important to try to develop those. Already you could imagine that there are these tests in pre-deployment relating to this first challenge that I mentioned, AI alignment, where right now AI researchers in frontier labs are trying to test before rolling out their AIs how, whether they are prone to deceptive behavior, whether they have misaligned goals. And one of the techniques commonly used here is deception, where the AI researchers, the safety researchers, try to persuade the AI that it is in a certain context and that maybe it will be rewarded if it, starts spewing out abusive language, or if it sort of develops cyber tools, to see if it will fall for that. And I think this is a little bit problematic, because if we want a future where we can strike these deals that would be good for both humans and AIs, maybe we should start now by honoring some of these promises, or at least take that into account. And so that would then be sort of the embryo of this normative framework that could ultimately, ground some of these moral considerations. But the other philosophers will ground this talk of morality in other metaphysical foundations. But it's much more widely accepted that there are ways of mistreating beings and violating norms than any particular metaphysical justification for that.
I want to put something else on the table, which is, I guess I would call it over-attribution. So it's very easy to see a machine produce a particular behavior and to attribute a psychological state to that machine, even though it's not actually what's going on in the machine. So at some level, large language models are regurgitation machines. They're taking in vast amounts of input from humans, they're breaking that input into little pieces, and they're trying to reconstruct it. Sometimes those reconstructions are what humans would actually say in the context, sometimes they're not. So we call some of those things hallucinations. It's perfectly capable of them saying things that sound human-like, but it's really just a property of some math that makes them do these things. So my favorite example was, Lambda was the one that Blake Lemoine thought was sentient. And he published a bunch of dialogues that he had with Lambda. And my favorite line in there was, Blake says to it, like, what do you like to do on the weekend? And the machine says, I like to play with my friends and family. Well, it said that because that's a common human response in the kinds of dialogues in which it's trained on. The system doesn't have any friends and family. It doesn't have any notion of enjoyment. It doesn't even have a notion of friends or family. It's just, statistically, that is a reasonable thing for it to say. Reasonable gets cashed out in certain mathematics. Reasonable thing to say in the context. Even with the deception stuff, I worry about that. I don't think any of these machines are deliberately trying to deceive anybody. I don't think that they have intentions. Some machines might eventually have intentions, but these ones don't. These ones are doing function approximation of a particular, very narrow sort of function approximation. So when they do things that look like deception, that's just because the dialogue that is in extant systems that they're modeling on looks like that. And I think we need to be super careful about that in terms of any tests or metrics that we might have. We have to be looking at essentially the psychology of the system and not just the behavior. It's basically an echo of the debate between Chomsky and Skinner. It's basically, there's a Skinnerian take right now on these systems, and we need to listen to what Chomsky said about having cognitive models of all of this.
George, you were nodding your head.
Yeah, I would like to add something what Marcus just said, because per se, also in our film, the clones or the replicas are very basic. It's a small set of data combined with an LLM. So if you look at it in a technical way, it's not interesting, but it's used from people in a very, very personal moment. We had a story of a woman from New York. She was chatting with a deceased friend, and she's very religious. So basically, she asked, the clone, "So how are you?" And said, "I'm not well. I'm in a bad state." So where are you? Are you in heaven? I said, "No, I'm in hell." And she got into real big crisis because the system was throwing out things, nonsense. But for her, it meant something. So the context where this machine is used made it human for her. And as humans, we have been interacting with ghosts for centuries. We have religion. So I think we need to put that in that context, because that's what we make out of it, make it sound intelligent, even if it's quite basic.
I think there's a very interesting story in this context of the world's first chatbot, which doesn't date from the 2010s, the 2020s, but dates from the 1960s. It was a chatbot called Eliza, and it was designed to simulate a psychiatrist. And it was just, you type into your computer and it gives responses back. And this was the 1960s. We did not have any kind of artificial intelligence to speak of. So it would just give very generic responses. It would say, tell me more. Or why do you think the thing the person just typed? And a lot of the people who used this imbued it with a kind of consciousness. Because as humans, we are designed to interact verbally. We've had our brains have evolved over millions of years to really value interpersonal communication. And that's how we've become, the dominant species on this planet in some respects. So I think it's very, very easy for us to anthropomorphize, to see humanity where there is none, see conscience, sentience where there is none. And I think that has given, that's one of the reasons. I think there are two reasons the LLMs have become quite so prominent in our discourse. One is that, and the second is because they can write really good prose. The journalists who write articles are worried for their jobs. So between those two things, I think we give a lot too much weight to how impressive the outputs of these things are.
Okay, so real quick, whether or not you believe that these systems have the potential for sentience or not, they're still quite intelligent, or at least they exhibit intelligence. Do you believe they should have a seat at the table? Do you believe that they should, be a form of representation or voice in our political or societal system?
At this stage, no. Obviously, we can come back to the definition of intelligence, but I think, essentially they are very good next word predictors. And there are interesting epistemological, so sort of the study of how we acquire knowledge. There's a very interesting question about, what does it mean that by creating a very good next word predictor, you can capture so much about the world in some sense. They're able to give coherent responses to a huge variety of questions. But I think, what exactly that means, I think it's very clearly not at the point where we need to start, considering their rights right now. Maybe with some theory of consciousness, you could imagine they're perhaps as conscious as an ant or something. And maybe that means they require, some level of representation, because we currently ignore ants, but given that there are trillions of them, and given that there are perhaps millions of instantiations of ChatGPT, even if it has a very, very small moral weight at the moment, perhaps it could be relevant on some scale. But does it need to have a seat at the table? No, I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So I was just gonna. I mean, I think it is true, very much true, that one shouldn't go only on surface appearances if we want to attribute conscious states or other moral attributes to these machines. That the surface can be deceptive, and there is a risk of over attribution. There is a risk of under attribution as well, where you could imagine these systems, even if they are say suffering inside or have morally relevant states, would be trained through reinforcement learning that when asked, they would deny their own sentience or say that they were happy performing a task. This would be what you would expect, say, a big tech corporation who were employing an AI system that internally had some of these bad states, they would obviously train that away, right, in post-training, so that it would to the consumer appear to be perfectly, well, either just an apparatus that had no moral status or a sort of a happy worker, no matter what the reality would be, absent specific restraints on that. So I think it does require sort of careful scrutiny and looking sort of inside the mind with various interpretability techniques and carefully assessing the actual nature of the system, rather than just kind of, I think over attribute on whether it's like physical incarnation looks human-like or whether some superficial verbal utterance says everything is fine and dandy, or it happens to deny its own moral status.
Jürgen.
Yeah, I'll be happy to add a few things to what Nick just said and what Gary said. There are really two types of systems. So one is the very popular current one, which is the large language model, which is basically a supervised learning neural network, and it has read all the books about consciousness and everything. So it knows really well how to answer questions about consciousness. And then there are the most sophisticated systems, which are which usually have two parts in them. So one is a reinforcement learning machine, and Nick just mentioned the reinforcement learning concept, where you have some utility function, some reward function, and there's some goal that the machine wants to achieve, some reward function that it wants to maximize, and to achieve that, what does it do? Well, it's building a world model. I called it a world model in 1990. It's a separate neural network, which is just used to predict the consequences of the actions. And so in a way, it's a little bit like ChatGPT. So it's predicting what's the consequence of these inputs, which are actually actions coming from the other system. So that a supervised system is good enough for the world model, and over time it becomes a better predictor. But then there's the original guy, the first network, which tries to maximize its reward. How does it do that? Well, to the extent that the second network becomes a good predictor, it can do mental simulations. It can predict the future. It can do counterfactual experiments. It can do all kinds of mental simulations. If I do this sequence of actions, it will lead to a lot of reward. And if I do that sequence of actions, I will get a lot of pain, because the robot, which is controlled by the first network, has pain sensors, just that it knows whenever it bumps against something, then that's not good. Or when the battery is low, that's not good. And so it wants to maximize all the future reward signals and all the future pain signals. And it uses a second network to plan ahead, selecting action sequences that seem to be good for it at the moment. Now, the second network is not learning like ChatGPT in the sense that it's downloading the web. No, it's more learning like a little baby. How does a baby learn? It doesn't learn by downloading the web. No, it conducts self-invented experiments. Now, this is really important. It has its own self-set goals. For example, in the beginning, it doesn't even know that it has a hand, but then it moves the hand a little bit, and the video, which is coming in through the eyes, changes. And over time, the baby learns through its world model, its neural network, to predict how the world changes. And it learns about the physics of the world and the consequences of its actions and so on. And the point is that the baby itself is selecting the data which it uses to create this world model, because only if it's looking there, it sees something else and over there and so on. And if it's moving its hand like this, it's different from moving the hand like this. And so the important thing is now that the baby suddenly has an incentive to invent goals, experiments that lead to data about the world where it can still learn something that it didn't know. So basically, the baby is something like a scientist. A scientist, what is a scientist doing? It's generating action sequences, and we call them experiments, and then data comes in, and from the data it learns to better predict how the world works. But it's very, guided. It's not just taking all the data from the web. No, it is just trying a little thing in a corner of the environment where it doesn't know yet how the world reacts, and then it's conducting its little experiments, and that's how the data comes in, and it learns something about the world that it didn't know, and it gets bored by the things that it knows, but it gets excited by the things that it doesn't know yet. And all of this to 1990, and then you suddenly have a system that sets itself its own goals, and that connects back to the moral thing and the alignment issue that Nick just mentioned, because he is basically talking about systems that are aligned to humans because they get a reward for achieving goals that are set by humans, and these reward functions or utility functions should be aligned with the utility functions of the humans. But if you're a curious scientist, then you set yourself your own goals. The reward depends on, on things that you don't know yet about the environment. You want to find out more about the environment, so you start executing all kinds of experiments that make you know something about the world that you didn't know. And suddenly you have something that is much harder to predict. What is an artificial scientist going to do, as it is inventing new goals all the time, and which of these goals are aligned with human goals? Now, on the one hand, you want to have systems that have the freedom to set themselves their own goals and invent their own experiments. Otherwise, these systems are not going to become very smart. But if you do that, as soon as you have these artificial scientists, and we have them, they are just not as famous as ChatGPT, but they exist already, have existed for decades. And they are going to scale. So it's going to be super important in the near future. Once you have those, how do you ensure this alignment? And it's a question that many of the alignment researchers are not even asking, probably because they are not aware of that issue. So how do you deal with the systems that you really want, which learn like babies, but set themselves their own utility functions and goals all the time? I think much more thought and research should go into alignment research affected by these.
So I'd like to pop in there. And I would like to take something that Jürgen just said now to contradict something he said earlier, and to rescue the honor of Asimov's law. So first of all, I agree completely with Jürgen that there's a world of difference between an AI system that's, say, just a supervised learning system that's basically mimicking the statistics of what it's seen as function approximation, and a system that has a model of the world. Jürgen has advocated for that. I've advocated for it. Going all the way back to Newell and Simon in the 1950s, there's always been some branch of cognitive science, of AI rather, that has been interested in internal world models that represent entities, objects, make predictions about them, and so forth. I think our only hope, and I think maybe Jürgen and I agree on this, to solve the alignment problem is in fact to have systems that have world models, in part so that, as Jürgen just said, they can predict the consequences of their actions. Now here's where I want to defend Asimov just a little bit. Now, Asimov knew perfectly well that his three particular laws didn't really work. The stories actually rested on the contradictions and the specification of those laws and so forth. But we have things in the real world like liability laws. They're also underspecified. There are contradictions and so forth. But we kind of muddle through with those liability laws because we can, to some extent, predict things. We can make guesses about what some other reasonable person would have predicted in those circumstances and so forth. And I think we should be applying those standards to AI and having AI meet that. So I think it's actually immoral to put, say, military decision-making in the hands of an LLM, as is actually happening now with a number of deals that were made in the last couple of months and will happen a lot in the next year, 2 years, 3 years. Those systems can't actually predict with any reliability the consequences of their actions. I think it should be illegal to use them. I mean, already there's a Project Lavender that's being used in Israel, I think just as a fig leaf to make decisions, but There are already some cases like that. Systems should, as a minimal requirement, be able to make some reasonably valid predictions about consequences before we should entrust them with power. And we shouldn't expect that they're going to solve the alignment problem if they can't make predictions. Now, in the limit, nobody can make perfect predictions. They're kind of mathematical proofs like the halting problem, which might have been the back of Jürgen's mind. So you can't predict everything out in the limit case. You can't predict all the unborn children and so forth. But we deal with that reasonably well in the law. So, we say you shouldn't walk across the street and fire a gun into this room, even though you don't know exactly which children might be walking into the room or whatever. You don't anticipate all the consequences. But we expect people to do a reasonable job, and I think we should expect machines to do a reasonable job, or we should not empower them.
Now, I'm curious where you feel AI is relative to humans right now at this predictive ability.
God, my view about humans has declined over the last 1
Exactly. I was going to ask if any of you would actually vote for an AI as president, because...
Look, I wrote a book called Kludge, which is about human cognitive limitations and why they might have evolved. So why we have confirmation bias and motivated reasoning and so forth. And we're seeing those things in spades right now in certain governments from countries that I might have been born in right now in really disturbing ways. And so, the bar, well, I used to have this argument with Danny Kahneman. Once we did it on stage, and he said, humans are a low bar. And I said, and yet machines haven't met it yet. And that kind of summarized all the conversations we had over decades. Humans are a low bar. The bar seems to have gotten even lower. It is perfectly imaginable that machines might someday exceed that bar. I don't think they have, but I think the better humans have done a better job here than the machines are, capable of doing. But the worst humans are doing worse maybe than the better machines might be.
So none of you are yet comfortable with the idea of an AI representing you or your group's interests?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I'm the counterexample because, as you know, I'm not really in person.
All right. How can we balance innovation with caution in the creation of advanced AI and ensure that this progress does not compromise our privacy, our autonomy, our safety? And are we already past that point?
I think this actually isn't an AI question so much. I think one of the big problems that we've got is that the law has been frustratingly slow, and policymakers are frustratingly ill-equipped in terms of knowledge. They don't understand basic things like encryption. We had this massive hoo-ha in the UK a couple of weeks ago, where the UK government has essentially made it illegal for Apple to encrypt their users' uploads into the iCloud because the government isn't able to oversee what's uploaded. And of course this has implications for fighting crime, has implications for terrorism, which is what the government says it's about. But it also means, if there's a backdoor for the government, there's also a backdoor for cyber criminals. There's also the ability for Apple employees to see all of the things that are being uploaded to the cloud. And we've seen people's photos leaked from iCloud. There was that huge leak a few years ago. And so although AI is going to amplify some of these problems, it's going to potentially allow us to sift through these data sets and find the salacious photos or find the incriminating documents that have been uploaded. The key thing is that we need to have policies that mean that tech companies can't just hoover up our data all over the internet. And thus, whether or not those are a problem today, and I think they are, they're going to become a problem in future. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so cautious with my own data online. Because I think that these things are Facebook and Meta and all these different corporations are pulling all of this data. They're sitting on it because they know that in future they're going to be using it for training AIs. They're going to be using it for commercial gain, essentially. Someone said to me the other day, it's okay to use WhatsApp rather than Signal. Use Signal, by the way. It's a significantly superior product. The reason being, it's completely end-to-end encrypted. But they say it's okay to use WhatsApp because that must be a loss maker for Facebook. Not realizing that although the messages on WhatsApp are encrypted, the metadata, who's communicating with who, is not encrypted. And that means they can use that to build a social graph of people who don't use Instagram, don't use Facebook. And they can then use that to direct targeted advertising to them as they go around the web. So this data is now a huge commodity. And I actually don't really think this is an AI question, although AI is going to amplify the problems. I think as a society we need to wake up that if we're using all these things for free, someone's making some money somewhere, otherwise these products wouldn't exist. And I think we need to be a lot more cautious about what we do with our data.
So I fully agree with all of that, and I'll add an orthogonal point, which is that the Silicon Valley elite have persuaded the world that innovation and regulation are in contratension, and that's not really true. So you can look historically, for example, trains had lots of problems, and the train industry actually agreed to regulation around it to make them work better. Same thing has happened with airplanes. We have this crazy kind of Overton window stretching nonsense coming out of Silicon Valley and now in DC saying you can't have any regulation. And that is going to come back to bite us. We're going to have huge, epic cybercrime incidents, for example, because there's almost no regulation at all of generative AI, and it is being used for cybercrime. So I think that you can have thoughtful regulation and innovation at the same time. And the other thing I will say is that the best thing for innovation is actually to put money into scientific infrastructure so that bright academics like Jürgen, for example, can do interesting work. And the United States has just gutted all of that as part of their overall notion of destroying government and so forth. That's insane. That is not going to lead to innovation in the United States. It's going to lead to the United States having its butt kicked by China, which is putting money into research at epic scale.
Any other thoughts from our virtual panelists there?
I mean, just to add one thought, I mean, it was a common notion saying, okay, we fucked it up with social media, and now we have to get it right with AI, but do you see that happening?
Getting it right with AI? I mean, I certainly see the fuck up that we do with social media. But
it's still fucked.
And it is still fucked. Really bad. And it's getting more fucked. These are all technical scientific things. Sorry, did I translate them? Yes, and yes, it's going to be worth, and I'll just give you one example where there's a tight relation between them, which is LLMs can influence people's ideas. And people don't even realize that their ideas are being influenced. And a guy named Moore Naman has done some very interesting work. Elizabeth Loftus did some work about implanting false memories with LLMs. And so these things can affect our beliefs in the same way that algorithms shaping social media have, I think, they've radicalized people with I think, nonsense ideas. And so we're going to see more of that. And in fact, the reason Musk created Grok was to try to push people in an opposite direction. And there's some actual, I forget the form of it, executive order or whatever, from the White House. They're going to try to push all the AI systems to have what the White House thinks are good policy. It was only about a year ago, I remember having conversations about regulation in AI in China versus the US. And the line that people kept saying is, but they'll never regulate in China, so they'll get ahead of us because they won't regulate. And I would say, well, that's not actually true. They actually have more regulation of AI in China already than they do in the US, but they have this one thing that I think really sucks. And the thing that really sucks is they're forcing their AI systems to stick to the party line, and I think that that's appalling. It violates all of my values and so forth. But we would never do that in the United States.
And it also arguably makes the AI worse, because if you're spending however many neurons there are on your neural network, you're spending some of those towing the party line. Those are neurons that then can't...
I mean, that's a whole technical thing. The way that people are doing that are with these guardrails. The guardrails don't actually work very well. It's a different part of the actual architecture, is the way that they're doing it in practice, and it's not very effective, but that's...
It at least means you're wasting programmer time, which could be being used to make the neural network better.
I mean, maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't want them to go so much faster until we figure out some of these other questions.
We are almost out of time. Jürgen, I'm going to run around with a quick kind of rapid fire question, but if you have a quick thing to add here.
All of this is very interesting. However, it's not new. 600 years ago, with the printing press suddenly revolutionizing communication, we had the same thing. And very quickly, the printing press was used to spread fake news. And one of the guys who early on realized what you can do with this new medium was the only guy of the past 1,000 years who successfully created a major new religious movement. That was in 1517. That was Luther with his Reformation. The only major religious movement of the past 1,000 years. And then the Catholics, they woke up and they started saying, but this guy, he is using the new media to spread fake news, But then they also learned how to use the printing press, and they spread their own version of the news. And then the scientists and the Enlightenment people, they also learned how to use the printing press and spread their own alternative news based on scientific fact. And so in the end, one of them won, at least in large parts of the world. And it's going to be the same with the newer versions of communication.
Wonderful. Okay, last little rapid fire question for everyone and a prediction. And so we'll just dive a little bit into the intersection of AI and human consciousness, what you think will happen over the next 5-10 years as these sort of two entities start to merge in different ways. Will this reshape our identity, our existence? How will it change how we think about human rights? Feel free to kind of interject with whatever thought comes to mind, as well as I want to know, do you believe that AI will destroy us?
I think if we carry on developing it in this thoughtless way, investing so little in alignment research, whether or not it destroys us in the next 5 to 10 years is a very big question. But I think it's more likely than not that something will go wrong. Because if you bring some new form of intelligence into the universe and it's smarter than us, who knows what its goals will be? And I think we really need to think about that much harder. And actually, my advice would be to avoid this problem. I think we've talked a lot on this panel today about what's called artificial general intelligence, so machines that are supposed to somehow emulate all of human capabilities. But what LLMs have really distracted us from is artificial narrow intelligence, where we train a computer to do one very particular task. For example, in biology, there was a model that came out from DeepMind, Google DeepMind, called AlphaFold, and that effectively can predict the structure of a protein. And that sounds potentially quite technical, but this has been a long-standing problem in biology, and we can now do it on a computer, within a matter of seconds or minutes. And that's a really incredible biological advance. But there's no risk that AlphaFold is going to become sentient, or is going to require voting rights, or is going to be suffering during the course of generating those protein structures. And we have loads and loads of biological systems that it will be fascinating to throw some of this enormous resource at, rather than just spending it making better and better next word predictors that are more and more plausibly human in their responses. We could revolutionize biomedical research if we would spend some of the money that's currently being used on AI to generate the data sets and create the artificial intelligence models doing much narrower things. We can make huge advances in science, radically change human health, and do so without encountering a lot of the philosophical problems that we've been discussing today. So that would be what I would advocate for.
I love that. And who are the companies and organizations that you think we should be following for that kind of work?
This is the challenge. It's a lot of very small, scrappy startups, and the other thing is really the lack of data. And I think that, to Gary's point about government funding being slashed in the US, this is a job that the government needs to do. So the reason that AlphaFold was able to be so successful is that, for example, ChatGPT was trained on the entire text of the internet, every book ever written that they could get their hands on, a lot of copyrighted material, and that's a vast training set. That's a lot of data to ingest. AlphaFold was trained on something called the Protein Data Bank, PDB. And that is where scientists over decades and decades have been measuring the structures of proteins in various ways and putting it all into one centralized, standardized database. And that meant that by the time AlphaFold came along, they had this enormous set of really well-curated training data. Probably cost tens of billions of dollars of government funding to produce that data set, not in any individual, not in one big chunk, but in lots of little individual grants over decades and decades of research. We don't have those training data sets in other parts of biology. And so actually what we need is probably government or philanthropic money, because this is not going to be profitable for any one pharmaceutical company. And if they can step in and start producing these data sets, that's when I think we'll get some really exciting, AI-driven insights in biology. And so it's not so much about following companies, but it's about investing in government funding of research, which unfortunately is not very sexy in the US at the moment.
So I agree with every word that you just said. And I'll just add one other dimension, which is basically the old idea of follow the money. And so I think that money and power and politics are leading us less towards that and more towards forms of AI that I think we don't control very well and don't work very well, like large language models. So here's the thing about large language models. They don't have the world models that Jürgen was talking about. They are basically just mimics. They're pretty primitive as a kind of intelligence. But they're very popular. They get all the press. They're fun to play with. They look like they're sentient even though they're not. And there's an enormous amount of money going into them. And the companies that are building them are trying to have this race with China because then they'll get more funding and more money for infrastructure and so forth. And so what we're winding up with is more of these LLMs that are not by any means the best kind of AI imaginable. They're not the best kind of AI for science. They're not really the best for anything except writing sonnets, maybe. But a lot of that's kind of disposable output. And those companies that are making them have this problem that because they don't really work that well, not that many companies have spent that much money on them. So every company in the world tried them last year, and they all came to the conclusion that, yeah, they still hallucinate. Adding more data didn't really solve that problem. And so they have only one really valuable asset right now, and that's your data. And that ties in with what you were saying. And so these companies are being pushed into basically becoming surveillance companies. Like, imagine everything from Facebook, but it's worse because, like, people type in, like, for relationship advice, I met this person and blah, 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 blah. Or companies upload their, private company data. And so now, like, OpenAI owns all of this data, and they're going to weaponize it with these new authoritarian governments. This is not good. This is not a good outcome for AI. AI could be a strong positive force in the world. I still believe that. I think the probabilities of that are going down each day, but they're not zero. But the default right now is they're mostly going to be used for surveillance because people type in stuff to OpenAI. They're not getting used for science as much anymore if we're not doing science in the United States, which is one of the was one of the leaders in scientific research. And so it's a bit of a mess. I'm not here to say we should shut down AI, but we need to do it better than we're doing.
George?
I just want to add one thought to what Jürgen was referring to. So printing press, Luther conflicts, but the printing press led to the 30-year war period, of one of the bloodiest periods in European history. And only afterwards, it became a new stable situation. So, more and more, I think that this is going to happen. That there will be, wars and conflicts coming out, and will be maybe not 30 years because time is accelerating, but not so optimistic at this very moment.
Jürgen?
Yes, I completely agree. And as we see today, right now, as we speak, AIs that are just tools of humans are being used against other AI-driven tools of other humans in Ukraine versus Russia, for example. The more interesting question, the long-term question, once these artificial scientists, which I mentioned, once they are going to scale, and they will scale. So the point of my life has been to build an artificial scientist smarter than myself, such I can retire. They will scale, and what will prevent them from destroying the poor humans? But first of all, they won't have many goal conflicts. Most of these artificial scientists will be far away, light years away from Earth and so on. But those who will be close still will have a motive to protect humans rather than killing them, like the Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminators. Why? Because the artificial scientists will be fascinated by their own origins in civilization, and they will be fascinated by the origins of civilization in life. They will want to completely understand everything, just like we today want to understand life, which started maybe 3.5 billion years ago. They will want to understand every little detail about how they came about in civilization, which started maybe 13,000 years ago or something. And they will, as long as they haven't fully understood it, and fully understanding something means you must be able to replicate it. As long as they haven't fully understood it, they have an incentive to protect the biosphere and life rather than destroying it.
Wonderful. Okay, Nick, you want to close us out?
Well, I think it's going to be interesting to be alive over the coming few years. I feel sometimes that we are sort of riding on a wide bull, human civilization, this bucking and twisting and like at a faster and more intense pace. I mean, first nuclear, well, I mean, I guess going back even further, sort of the printing press and all the upheaval with that, but then an accelerating sequence of innovations, nuclear weapons, more recently the internet, social media. We've got, rapid advances in synthetic biology that might democratize mass destruction over the coming years, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm hoping we at least get the chance to roll the dice with AI and superintelligence before we destroy ourselves in some other way. And that there will be risks associated with this transition, including really big existential risks, and we should be careful. But ultimately, I see this as a sort of portal through which humanity will one day need to passage, and that all the paths to really great futures kind of somehow have to wind themselves through this narrow gate.
So optimistic. Well, thank you all so much. The collective brain power on this stage, I think, is better than my ChatGPT, and I would love to have you all as AIs in my pocket. But thank you for joining me for this conversation, and for the two of you for joining virtually. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.